The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty trail as Jake Morrison rode his horse through the canyon. He was a simple cowboy, weathered by years under the open sky, with calloused hands and a heart that had seen too much suffering in the world. The leather reins felt familiar in his grip as he guided his mare, Belle, toward the trading post in Cedar Valley. Jake had been riding for 2 days straight, delivering a message from his ranch owner to the territorial governor. The job paid well enough to keep food on his table and hay for Belle, but it meant long, lonely rides through dangerous country. He preferred it that way, though. People complicated things, and Jake had learned that the hard way. The sound hit him first. A sharp crack echoing off the canyon walls, followed by a woman's cry of pain. Jake pulled Belle to a stop, his hand instinctively moving to the Colt revolver at his hip. He listened carefully, trying to determine where the sounds were coming from. Another crack, another cry, and Jake's jaw tightened. He dismounted quietly, tying Belle's reins to a sturdy juniper bush. Moving on foot, he crept toward the ridge overlooking a small clearing below. What he saw made his blood run cold. 3 men in military uniform stood around a young Native American woman who was tied to a wooden post. One of them held a leather whip, and Jake could see fresh marks across her back where her torn dress revealed wounded skin. The woman couldn't have been more than 20 years old. Her long black hair hung in tangles around her face, but even through her obvious pain, Jake could see the defiance burning in her dark eyes. She refused to cry out, though her body trembled with each lash of the whip. "Tell us where your people are hiding the stolen cattle," barked the sergeant, a heavy-set man with a graying beard. "We know your tribe took them from the Henderson ranch." The woman spat blood into the dirt but said nothing. Her silence only seemed to anger the soldiers more. "Maybe she needs more motivation," sneered one of the younger soldiers, rolling up his sleeves. "I've got other ways to make Indians talk." Jake had seen enough. He'd witnessed too much cruelty in his 32 years, and something about this woman's courage struck him deep in his chest. She reminded him of his younger sister, Maria, who had died of fever when Jake was just 16. Maria had that same fire in her eyes, that same refusal to bow down to anyone who tried to break her spirit. Moving carefully, Jake positioned himself behind a large boulder where he could get a clear shot at all 3 men. He drew his revolver and checked the chambers. 6 bullets, 3 men. He'd have to make each shot count. "This is your last chance, Savage," the sergeant said, raising the whip again. "Tell us where those cattle are, or things are going to get much worse for you." The woman lifted her head and looked directly at the sergeant. "My people do not steal," she said clearly, her voice steady despite her pain. "We hunt what the Great Spirit provides. Your cattle wandered onto our land, and we returned them to the trading post 2 days ago." The sergeant's face reddened with rage. "Liar!" he shouted, bringing the whip down with brutal force. Jake stepped out from behind the boulder. "That's enough," he called out, his revolver trained on the sergeant. All 3 soldiers spun around, hands reaching for their weapons. Jake's voice was calm but deadly serious. "I wouldn't do that if I were you, boys. This here's a hair trigger, and I've got a clear shot at each one of you." The sergeant squinted at Jake, trying to assess this unexpected threat. "This ain't your business, cowboy. We're conducting official military business here." Official business?" Jake laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Torturing an unarmed woman? That's not military business. That's just being a coward." The youngest soldier, barely out of his teens, started to edge toward his rifle propped against a nearby tree. Jake swung his aim toward him. "Don't even think about it, boy. I was shooting before you were born." "You're interfering with a federal investigation?" the sergeant blustered. "That's a hanging offense." Jake kept his gun steady. "And what you're doing to her is murder. Cut her loose, now." The tension in the clearing was thick as molasses. Jake could see the wheels turning in the sergeant's head, calculating whether he and his men could draw their weapons fast enough. Jake had been in enough standoffs to read the signs. These men were going to make a play. "Look, mister," the sergeant said, his voice taking on a more reasonable tone. "We're just following orders. This squaw's people stole valuable livestock, and we need information. How about you just ride on and we'll forget you were ever here? Jake noticed the sergeant's hand slowly moving toward his sidearm. I said cut her loose, Jake repeated, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. The woman's eyes met Jake's for a moment, and he saw something there that surprised him. Not just gratitude, but a kind of recognition, as if she was seeing something in him that he didn't even know was there. That moment of distraction was all the sergeant needed. Now, he shouted, diving for his gun. Jake's training took over. Years of quick-draw practice and life-or-death situations had honed his reflexes to lightning speed. His first shot caught the sergeant in the shoulder, spinning him around before he could clear leather. The second shot took down the young soldier who had been reaching for his rifle. The third man, seeing his companions fall, threw up his hands in surrender. "Please don't shoot," the remaining soldier cried. "I was just following orders." Jake kept his gun trained on the man while he walked over to the woman. Up close, he could see that her injuries were serious but not life-threatening. The whip marks were deep, but they would heal. Her wrists were raw from the ropes, and there was dried blood on her lip where someone had struck her. "Can you ride?" Jake asked quietly as he cut through the ropes binding her to the post. She nodded, though Jake could see the effort it took for her to stay upright. "Yes, but my horse ... She looked around the clearing. "They probably scattered the animals when they took you," Jake said. He turned to the surrendering soldier. "Where's her horse?" We turned it loose about a mile back," the man stammered. "We didn't hurt it, I swear." Jake studied the man's face and decided he was telling the truth. Fear had a way of making people honest. "What's your name, soldier?" "Private Thompson, sir." "Look, I never wanted any part of this. The sergeant, he said we were just going to ask some questions. I didn't know he was going to ... You didn't know he was going to what?" Jake's voice was hard as steel. "Torture an innocent woman? What did you think was going to happen when you tied her up and brought out a whip?" Private Thompson had no answer for that. Jake looked at the other two soldiers. The sergeant was alive but unconscious, bleeding from his shoulder wound. The young one Jake had shot in the leg was conscious but in no shape to cause trouble. "Here's what's going to happen," Jake told Thompson. "You're going to patch up your friends, and then you're all going to ride back to whatever fort you came from. And you're going to report that you found no evidence of cattle theft by the local tribes." "But sir, we can't..." Jake's gun came up again. "You can, and you will. Because if I ever hear of you boys bothering peaceful native folks again, I'll come looking for you. And next time, I won't aim for your shoulders and legs. We clear?" Thompson nodded frantically. "Yes, sir, crystal clear." Jake turned back to the woman who was watching the exchange with interest. Despite her injuries, there was something regal about the way she carried herself, something that commanded respect. "What's your name?" Jake asked gently. "Ayana," she said. "It means eternal blossom in my people's tongue." "Well, Ayana, I'm Jake Morrison. I've got a horse nearby, and I can take you wherever you need to go." She looked at him carefully as if trying to read his intentions. "Why did you help me?" Most white men would have ridden past. Jake was quiet for a moment, considering her question. "I guess because somebody should have helped my sister when she needed it, but nobody did." Something shifted in Ayana's expression. She nodded slowly, understanding passing between them without need for more words. As they walked back toward where Jake had left Belle, he could hear Thompson helping his wounded companions behind them. Jake kept his hand near his gun until they were well out of sight. He'd learned never to trust a man's word when his friends were bleeding. Belle nickered softly when she saw them approaching. Jake helped Ayana mount behind him, being careful of her injuries. As they rode away from the clearing, Ayana leaned forward and spoke quietly in his ear. "There is something you should know, Jake Morrison. Those men spoke truly about cattle being taken, but it was not my people who took them." Jake turned slightly in the saddle. "Who then?" "White men dressed as Indians. I was trying to track them when the soldiers found me. They have been stealing cattle and horses throughout the territory, letting my people take the blame." This news hit Jake like a punch to the gut. If what she was saying was true, then innocent people were being punished for crimes they didn't commit. It wouldn't be the first time, but that didn't make it right. Can you prove it? He asked. I saw them with my own eyes. 3 white men with painted faces, driving Henderson's cattle toward the Badlands. I followed them for 2 days before the soldiers caught me. Jake felt a familiar anger building in his chest. He'd seen too much injustice in his life, and he was getting tired of looking the other way. Where exactly did you see them? There's a hidden canyon about T. Jake woke before dawn to the sound of someone moving quietly outside his cabin. His hand instinctively reached for the revolver he kept beside his bed. Living alone on the frontier had taught him to sleep light and wake ready for trouble. The wooden floor was cold under his bare feet as he crept to the window and peered through a gap in the curtains. Ayanna stood in his yard, perfectly still like a statue carved from shadow. She held the reins of a beautiful paint horse, its coat gleaming in the early morning light. Jake rubbed his eyes, wondering if he was still dreaming. He had delivered her safely to her village the evening before, watching as her grandmother fussed over her injuries while other women of the tribe prepared healing medicines. The last he'd seen of her, she was being led into a large tipi to rest and recover. What was she doing at his cabin? And how had she even found it? Jake had never told her where he lived, and his small homestead was well off the beaten path. Hidden in a grove of cottonwood trees near a bend in the creek, he dressed quickly and stepped outside, the morning air crisp against his skin. Ayanna turned at the sound of his footsteps, and Jake was struck again by how poised she appeared despite everything she had been through. Her back was straight, her dark eyes alert and determined. Someone had braided her long black hair and provided her with clean clothes, soft buckskin pants, and a beaded shirt that caught the first rays of sunlight. "Morning," Jake said, his voice still rough with sleep. "You're up early." "I do not sleep well in enclosed spaces," Ayanna replied. "The walls make me feel trapped." She gestured toward his cabin. "How do you bear it?" Jake looked back at his modest home, one room with a stone fireplace, a simple bed, table, and chairs he had built himself. It wasn't much, but it was more shelter than he'd had growing up. "I guess I got used to it, coffee." She nodded, and Jake went back inside to start a fire and put the pot on. Through the window, he watched her unsaddle her horse and lead it to his small corral, where Belle immediately came over to investigate the newcomer. The 2 horses touched noses briefly before. Belle decided the paint was acceptable and went back to cropping grass. When Jake emerged with 2 cups of steaming coffee, he found Ayanna sitting cross-legged on a fallen log, studying the surrounding forest with the intensity of someone reading a book. "See anything interesting?" he asked, handing her a cup. "Your cabin is well hidden," she said, accepting the coffee gratefully. "But not from someone who knows how to look? You chose this place carefully." Jake settled onto the log beside her, leaving respectful space between them. "A man in my line of work makes enemies. Sometimes it pays to be hard to find." "What is your line of work, Jake Morrison?" It was a simple question, but Jake found himself hesitating. Most people assumed he was just a drifting cowboy, and he preferred to let them think that. But something about Ayanna made him want to be honest. "I guess you could say I solve problems for people who can't solve them themselves," he said finally. "Sometimes that means delivering messages. Sometimes it means finding lost things. And sometimes ... double quotes he trailed off. Sometimes it means helping people who have nowhere else to turn," Ayanna finished. Jake looked at her with surprise. "How did you have the eyes of someone who has seen much injustice. And yesterday you risked your life for a stranger? That tells me what kind of man you are." They drank their coffee in comfortable silence while the sun climbed higher, burning off the morning mist that clung to the creek. Jake found himself stealing glances at his unexpected visitor. In the daylight he could see that her injuries from the previous day were healing remarkably well. The native remedies her people used were clearly effective. "You said you would help me stop the thieves," Ayanna said eventually. "I have come to take you to see their hiding place." Jake had been thinking about that promise. In the clear light of morning, it seemed like a dangerous proposition. "Ayanna, I appreciate what you went through yesterday, but maybe we should report what you saw to the territorial marshal. Let the law handle it." She turned to face him fully, her dark eyes serious. The territorial marshal is 3 weeks' ride from here. How many more cattle will be stolen? How many more of my people will be blamed and punished while we wait for the law to arrive? Jake knew she was right, but that didn't make him feel better about what she was proposing. Even if we find proof, what then? There's only 2 of us against however many thieves. 3, Ayana corrected. My cousin Tahomo meet us. He is the best tracker in our tribe and knows these lands better than the deer know them. Despite his misgivings, Jake found himself nodding. Maybe it was the way she looked at him, like she believed he was capable of more than he thought himself. Or maybe it was the memory of those soldiers and their whip. Either way, he knew he wasn't going to back down. All right, he said. But we do this smart. No unnecessary risks. We gather evidence and get out. Ayana smiled, and Jake felt that same warm feeling in his chest he'd experienced the night before. Thank you, Jake Morrison. You will not regret this. As they prepared to leave, Jake gathered supplies, rope, his telescope, extra ammunition, and jerky for the trail. He also strapped on his gun belt and checked his rifle. If they were riding into trouble, he intended to be ready for it. Ayana watched him methodically prepare, her expression thoughtful. You have done this before, she observed. Done what? Prepared for a fight you might not walk away from. Jake paused in loading his saddlebags. She was right, of course. He had developed these habits during the war, refined them afterward during some difficult years when survival meant being ready for anything. I suppose I have. What happened to make you this way? It was a personal question, but somehow Jake didn't mind her asking. Lost some people I cared about because I wasn't prepared enough. Swore it wouldn't happen again. Ayana nodded as if she understood perfectly. My father was the same way. He said a warrior's greatest weapon is not his bow or knife, but his willingness to think ahead. They rode out as the sun reached its peak, following game trails that wound through dense forest and rocky outcroppings. Ayana led the way with the confidence of someone who had traveled these paths since childhood. Jake was impressed by her knowledge of the terrain. She seemed to know every stream crossing, every hidden valley, every shortcut through the hills as they rode. She told him more about the cattle thefts. They had been going on for over 2 months, always following the same pattern. Small groups of livestock would disappear from outlying ranches, usually at night. The thieves were careful never to take so many animals that it would be noticed immediately, but over time the losses were adding up. Ranch owners were getting angry, and their anger was being directed at the nearest native tribes. It is a clever plan, Ayana admitted grudgingly. Create conflict between the ranchers and my people while they profit from the chaos. Any idea who might be behind it? Ayana was quiet for a moment. There are rumors. A man named Marcus Webb has been buying large numbers of cattle from Mexican dealers, asking no questions about their origins. He has a ranch near the border, far from here. Jake knew the name. Marcus Webb had a reputation as someone who bent the rules when it suited him. If Webb was involved, it would explain how the stolen cattle were being moved and sold without attracting attention from local authorities. They met Tahoma at a predetermined spot near a natural rock formation that resembled a giant eagle with spread wings. Jake's first impression of Ayana's cousin was that he was exactly the kind of man you'd want on your side in a fight. Tall and lean with intelligent eyes and the quiet confidence of someone completely at home in the wilderness. Greeted his cousin warmly, speaking briefly in their native language before turning to Jake. Ayana tells me you are willing to help us. This is good. Too many white men talk about justice but do nothing when they see injustice. I'm not looking to be a hero, Jake said honestly. I just think people should be held accountable for their actions. Tahoma nodded approvingly. This is wisdom. Heroes often die young. Smart men live long enough to see justice done. The 3 of them continued toward the hidden canyon Ayana had discovered. The terrain became increasingly difficult as they climbed into the Badlands, following narrow trails that seemed to disappear and reappear among the rocks. Jake was grateful for his guides. he would have been hopelessly lost within the first mile. As they approached their destination, Tahoma called for a halt. He dismounted and examined the ground carefully, reading sign that was invisible to Jake's eyes. "Fresh tracks," he reported quietly. "At least 6 riders passed this way since yesterday. And they were driving cattle." They left their horses hidden in a grove of scrub oak and continued on foot, climbing carefully through jumbled boulders toward the rim of the canyon. The sound of lowing cattle drifted up from below, confirming what they hoped to find. Jake used his telescope to survey the scene below. The hidden canyon was larger than he had expected, with steep walls that would make it nearly impossible to find unless you knew exactly where to look. A temporary corral had been built near the back wall, and Jake counted at least 50 head of cattle bearing various brands. Several men moved among the animals, and Jake could see a rough camp set up near a small spring. "There," Ayana whispered, pointing toward. Jake knew something was wrong the moment he saw Belle's ears. His Murray stood alert at the corral fence, nostrils flared and eyes fixed on the forest beyond his cabin. She only acted that way when strangers were nearby, and strangers at his hidden homestead usually meant trouble. He had been cleaning his rifle on the front porch when Belle's warning caught his attention. The sun was setting, painting the sky in deep purples and gold, and Jake had been expecting Ayana and Tahoma to return soon with final details about their plan to capture the cattle thieves. Instead, it looked like the thieves had found them first. Moving carefully, Jake slipped inside his cabin and retrieved his gun belt and a box of extra ammunition. Through the window, he could see at least 3 riders approaching through the trees, trying to stay hidden but failing to account for Belle's sharp senses. They moved like men who weren't familiar with the terrain, which meant they weren't locals. Jake's mind raced as he considered his options. The cabin offered good cover but could become a trap if he was surrounded. The corral and barn provided alternate positions but less protection. His best chance was to even the odds before the riders got close enough to pin him down. He slipped out the back door and worked his way through the trees toward where the intruders would emerge. Years of hunting and war had taught him to move quietly, and the soft pine needles muffled his footsteps. As he got closer, he could hear voices discussing their approach. "Morrison's cabin should be just ahead," one man said in a gravelly voice Jake didn't recognize. "Boss wants him taken alive if possible, but don't take any unnecessary risks." "What about the Indians?" asked another voice, younger and nervous. "Kill them. We can't afford to have witnesses running around." Jake's blood ran cold. They knew about Ayana and Tahoma, which meant someone had been watching them at the canyon. Worse, his new friends were walking into an ambush they didn't know was coming. He crept closer until he could see the 3 riders through the undergrowth. The leader was a hard-looking man with a silver mustache and expensive clothes that marked him as more than just a hired gun. The other 2 were clearly hired muscle, big, rough men with the kind of scars that came from violent lives. Jake had to make a decision quickly. He could try to pick them off from hiding, but gunfire would bring more trouble and alert anyone else in the area. He needed information more than he needed a fight. Who was behind this? How much did they know? And most importantly, how could he warn Ayana and Tahoma? The decision was made for him when he heard the sound of horses approaching from the opposite direction. Ayana and Tahoma were returning, completely unaware of the trap waiting for them. Jake had maybe 2 minutes before his friends rode into a crossfire. He stepped out of the trees with his rifle aimed at the leader. "That's far enough, gentlemen. Let's keep this civilized." The 3 men reined in their horses, hands moving toward their weapons before stopping when they saw Jake's rifle. The leader smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Jake Morrison, I presume?" "I'm Thomas Crawford, representing certain business interests in this territory. I think we need to have a conversation." "I'm listening," Jake said, though he kept his rifle trained on Crawford. "But make it quick. I'm expecting company. Yes, your Indian friends." "That's actually what I wanted to discuss." Crawford's voice was smooth and cultured, but Jake could hear the menace underneath. "You've been poking around in business that doesn't concern you. My employers would like you to stop." "And who might your employers be?" Crawford's smile widened. "Let's just say they're people who don't like interference with their legitimate enterprises." Jake almost laughed. Legitimate? Is that what you call cattle rustling now? Strong accusations require strong proof, Mr. Morrison, and from what I understand, you have no proof of anything except what a savage woman told you, the casual racism. In Crawford's voice made Jake's finger tighten on the trigger, but he forced himself to stay calm. Funny thing about proof, sometimes it has a way of turning up when you least expect it. The sound of approaching horses was getting closer. Jake could hear Ayanna and Tahoma talking quietly as they rode, still unaware of the danger. He had to end this confrontation before they arrived, but Crawford seemed determined to drag things out. "Here's what's going to happen," Crawford said, his pleasant mask finally slipping. "You're going to walk away from whatever foolish crusade you think you're on. You're going to forget about cattle and Indians and anything else that doesn't directly concern you. And in return you get to keep breathing. And if I refuse?" Crawford shrugged. "Then we'll be forced to resolve this situation in a more permanent manner. Along with your friends, unfortunately." Jake heard something that made his heart stop. The conversation between Ayanna and Tahoma had ceased, which meant they had spotted something wrong. His friends were smart enough to recognize danger, but they might not realize how much danger they were in. "You know what, Crawford? I think I'll pass on your generous offer." Jake's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. "And I think you and your boys should ride out of here while you still can." Crawford's facade of civility finally cracked completely. "Kill him," he ordered his men, but Jake was already moving. Years of surviving by his reflexes served him well as he dove behind a large pine tree just as bullets started flying. Bark exploded around him as Crawford's men opened fire, their shots wild and hurried. Jake rolled to a new position and returned. Fire, his first shot taking down one of the gunmen before the man could fully draw his weapon. The second gunman was better trained, finding cover and laying down a steady stream of bullets that kept. Jake pinned behind the tree. That's when Ayanna and Tahoma entered the fight. Jake heard the distinctive whistle of arrows cutting through the air, followed by a cry of pain from the remaining gunman. Tahoma's archery skills were legendary among his people, and he could put an arrow exactly where he wanted it from distances that would challenge most rifle shots. Crawford, realizing his advantage had evaporated, spurred his horse toward the cover of the forest. But Ayanna had anticipated his retreat route, emerging from the trees on her paint horse to block his escape. Crawford raised his pistol toward her, but Jake's rifle cracked again and the gun flew from Crawford's hand, his trigger finger probably broken by the impact. "I wouldn't move if I were you," Jake called out, stepping into the open with his rifle trained on Crawford. "My friends here aren't as forgiving as I am when it comes to people who threaten innocent folks." Tahoma appeared from the forest, his bow still drawn with an arrow nocked and ready. The remaining gunman was on the ground, clutching his shoulder where Tahoma's arrow had found its mark. The man would live, but his fighting days were over for a while. Crawford sat his horse with his wounded hand pressed against his chest, his face pale but still defiant. "This won't end here, Morrison. You have no idea who you're dealing with. Then why don't you enlighten me?" Jake suggested, moving closer. "Who's paying you to steal cattle and frame innocent people?" For a moment, Crawford looked like he might talk. Fear had a way of loosening tongues, and the man was clearly realizing his situation was hopeless. But then his expression hardened again. "Go to hell," he spat. Ayanna dismounted and walked over to examine the wounded gunman. She spoke to him quietly in English, her voice gentle but firm. "Your boss has abandoned you? You are hurt and need medical attention. Tell us what we want to know, and we will make sure you receive help." The gunman looked up at her with surprise, clearly not expecting compassion from someone he had been sent to kill. After a moment, he began to talk. "Webb," he gasped. "Marcus Webb hired us. Has a big operation going, stealing cattle from ranches all over the territory, changing the brands, selling them in Mexico. Makes a fortune and nobody can prove anything." Crawford's face went white with rage. "Shut your mouth, you fool." But the wounded man was beyond caring about his employer's anger. The pain from his arrow wound and the realization that he'd been left behind had broken whatever loyalty he might have felt. "Webb's got judges and territorial officials in his pocket," the gunman continued. Plans to blame everything on the local tribes, maybe start a war to grab their land too. Says there's money to be made in Indian wars if you know the right people. Jake felt sick. It was worse than simple cattle rustling. Webb was planning to use the thefts to justify violence against Ayana's people, probably seizing their land and the chaos that would follow. It was a scheme that could lead to the deaths of hundreds of innocent people. Where can we find proof of this? Tahoma asked, his arrow still aimed at Crawford. The gunman looked around nervously. Webb's got records at his ranch. Business correspondence, payment receipts, all of it. He thinks he's too smart to get caught, so he keeps detailed books. Crawford had heard enough. With his good hand, he suddenly spurred his horse toward Jake, clearly hoping to knock him down and escape in the confusion. But Jake was ready for the desperate move. He sidestepped the charging horse and brought his rifle, but up hard, catching Crawford in the ribs and sending him tumbling to the ground. "That was stupid," Jake said, standing over the fallen man. "But I appreciate you making this easy." As they secured their prisoners, Ayana moved close to Jake. "This is bigger than we thought. If Webb has officials protecting him, then we'll nay."